Hey, my name is Chris Brennan from the Astrology Podcast, and this is your horoscope for the entire year ahead for Libra rising for the year of 2021. So you can look at these horoscopes from the perspective of your sun sign if your sun is in Libra, or your moon sign if your moon is in Libra, but your rising sign or ascendant in Libra is preferred since that'll be more personal to you based on your birth chart. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. So here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and where they'll end up in the signs of the zodiac by the end of the year. So some of the main points that I wanted to focus on this year for Libra is that Saturn and Jupiter have recently moved into your fifth house of children, creative expression, and sex and sexuality. Here's a diagram that shows the significations of the fifth house according to most traditions of Western astrology. So this is the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction that occurred, the Great Conjunction in Aquarius back in December, but that Great Conjunction in your fifth house is actually going to be active for pretty much the entirety of 2021, where Saturn is starting a 3-year transit through that sign, and Jupiter is going to be transiting through that sign until December of 2021, until the end of this year, so pretty much the entire year. So these are long-term transits. Saturn, on the one hand, part of the good news is that you've just ended some long-term transits of Saturn through your fourth house of your home and living situation and family. So sometimes that can be a period that can coincide with setbacks or obstacles or difficulties with respect to your living situation or your relationship with your parents or situations happening in your parents and your private life. So it's kind of a positive thing that you've finished that transit, which started way back in December of 2017. Additionally, as soon as we move into January, Mars has moved out of Aries and has completed its 6-month transit through Aries as a result of its retrograde period that happened in the second half of 2020. So that was in your 7th house of relationships, and sometimes for some people could have coincided with a period of greater strife or tensions or difficulties, potentially even losses when it comes to close interpersonal relationships, whether romantic relationships or business partnerships. So that's also a transit that you're moving out of at the very top of the year. So the new transit that started with Saturn in your fifth house can bring a more serious period when it comes to if you have children or you're thinking about having children. Sometimes matters in that area can just become much more heavy or much more serious. There could be some obstacles or some potential setbacks in that area that you have to work through or push through in some way. For those that are creatives, this could also coincide with a period in which you have to put in a lot of hard work, or you might encounter some obstacles or blockages in terms of your creative expression. The fifth house is also the place of sex and sexuality, so it may be an area where you run into some issues with Saturn transiting through the fifth house, and you have to explore ways to work around that or explore ways in which maybe you just can't proceed further in a certain area and you need to go in a different direction. So Saturn, sometimes in representing or symbolizing limitations, sometimes it sets up limitations that are surmountable and are sort of like the cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger type scenarios. But other times it can just set up a wall that is not surmountable and that you have to then cope with the new understanding or the new information in your life that you've met an area where you cannot proceed further. So figuring out the distinction between which of those two scenarios it is may be part of your goal over the course of the next few years as Saturn is transiting through that sector of your chart. There was probably a preview of this for a few months in the second quarter of 2020 when Saturn dipped into Aquarius between the beginning of April and the very beginning of July. There would have been a little preview where Saturn dipped into Aquarius for a little bit, and there might have been a crisis or some issue that came up in this sector of your chart and in this sector of your life to give you sort of a preview of what the next 3 years will be about as this long-term transit plays out of Saturn moving through Aquarius. So the good news, though, for 2021 is that Saturn will not be transiting through that sign on its own, but instead will be going through that sign with Jupiter. Jupiter will bring a lot more optimism, a lot more hope and sense of expansion and confirmation and stabilization in this area of your life. So that's going to help to balance out some of the more restrictive indications of Saturn. And a large part of your goal during 2021 will be attempting to seek balance or equilibrium between the more optimistic and the more pessimistic directions that those two planets will tend to draw you in over the course of the next 12 months. So that's one transit that I wanted to talk about. The other thing going on this year is transiting Uranus, which is transiting through your eighth house of shared resources, will be squaring Saturn, and that square will go exact 3 different times during the course of this year. So Saturn transiting your eighth house of shared resources can indicate sudden fluctuations and unexpected disruptions of shared finances or the role of other people's money in your life, where it will fluctuate upwards or downwards. So some of this can be a bit destabilizing. And for some reason this year, with transiting Uranus squaring transiting Saturn in your 5th house, there may be some sort of connection between 5th house topics pertaining to children or creativity or sexual expression, and 8th house topics of other people's money, shared resources. The 8th house can also sometimes pertain to more obscure topics like inheritance or debt or taxes. Also, the 8th house is traditionally the house that has to do with mortality, and sometimes that topic can come up in different ways. So there's going to be 3 exact squares between Saturn and Uranus this year, and especially for those of you that have planets in your birth chart between 7 and 13 degrees of the fixed signs, that's going to be especially sensitive this year to those 3 squares, which are going to occur first in mid-February at 7 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus, then in mid-June at 13 degrees of the same signs, and then finally again once more on December 24th at 11 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus. So those are going to be, that's the period where the Saturn-Uranus squares are going to be at its height, and there's going to be this tension between restrictive significations of Saturn going through your 5th house and the more liberatory or unexpected or disruptive significations of Uranus going through your 8th house. There will be a few specific points this year when Mars transits into the fixed signs that could activate or trigger those transits of Saturn and Uranus when Mars makes hard aspects to Saturn and Uranus pretty close together. So one set is in January, from January 13th to January 20th, when Mars squares Saturn and conjoins Uranus. Then there's another one in early July when Mars opposes Saturn and squares Uranus, July 1st through the 3rd. And then finally one more hit when Mars goes through Scorpio and squares Saturn on November 10th and then opposes Uranus on November 17th. So those are important dates to look out for, just in terms of potential triggers or potential turning points where Mars may act as a catalyst, which could bring either some energy in the best case scenario or potentially some tensions, or strife is another signification of Mars, which could make the focus or put the focus more squarely on Mars and Saturn around those dates. So pay attention to that as potential tension points during the course of the year. Other things happening this year are eclipses taking place in your 9th, 3rd, and 8th houses. Here's some of the dates for the eclipses. So the first set occurs in May and June, and that's a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius on May 26th, followed by a solar eclipse in Gemini on June 10th. So my keyword for eclipses is great beginnings and great endings in your life. And in your chart, this is going to fall in your 3rd house and 9th house axis, which is really about, the 9th house is about learning and education and travel and developing one's personal philosophy or religious beliefs. Whereas the 3rd house traditionally signifies things like siblings, short distance travel, education in school, and especially communication. So one of the tricks for you as you're going through this eclipse series is probably developing new beliefs and learning things about the world and about how you think about the world and how you organize and structure your beliefs about the world, especially in terms of your personal philosophy and religious beliefs, but then also trying to learn how to communicate some of those things to other people and having major starting points of starting new educational and learning pursuits, but also having new starting points and ending points in terms of just figuring out how you communicate with other people in your life, those things that you believe or have come to believe recently, and how sometimes those two things can interact with and change each other in significant ways, one's beliefs versus the way that one communicates. So for some of you, if you have siblings, this could indicate major developments in terms of siblings. For those of you that have any interaction with foreign countries or people from cultures that are much different from your own, they could start playing a much more significant role in your life at this point, with those eclipses taking place in your ninth house. A lot of this should be a continuation of some themes that started in 2020 when the eclipses already started taking place in those signs. First back in June with an eclipse in Sagittarius, and then especially from late November and early December of 2020, there was a lunar eclipse in Gemini in your ninth house and a solar eclipse in Sagittarius on December 14th in Sagittarius. So the eclipse series this year is more of a continuation of that rather than something that's going to be brand new and sort of out of nowhere. You should already have some sense of what that's about at this point in your life. All right, so that's the first set of eclipses. There's a second set of eclipses, and one of those is a final eclipse in Sagittarius, which should bring to completion some of the third house significations having to do with siblings and communication at that point in late 2021. But then there's this really interesting partial lunar eclipse that occurs in Taurus on November 19th, and this is falling in your 8th house again, which is the same house that we talked about earlier, where transiting Uranus is already moving through at this point and has been for the past couple of years since, I think, 2018 and especially 2019. So the 8th house, as I said before, is especially about shared resources and other people's money. And this is the first eclipse occurring towards the end of 2021 of a series of eclipses that's going to start taking place in the financial sector of your chart, where first we'll have this eclipse in Taurus here in late 2021, and then 6 months later, there'll be an eclipse in Scorpio in your second house of personal finances and resources. So there's a shift that starts happening late in 2021 where it moves out of the eclipses move out of the educational and communicative sector of your chart, and they start instead highlighting major beginnings and major endings when it comes to financial matters in your life and matters pertaining to personal possessions and the role that that plays both in terms of your own possessions as well as the money or resources that belong to other people in your life in general. So that's sort of a starting point. It doesn't fully happen in 2021, but I wanted to mention it because it's opening a sequence of events that's going to carry through into the entirety of 2022 and possibly into some themes that will come up in 2023. So pay attention to anything that starts to arise in that area of your life starting in November of 2021. All right, let's see what other main points I meant to mention here. The last thing I want to mention is just Jupiter ingressing into Pisces and into your 6th house of work and health in late December of 2021. So this is going to be a shift into your 6th house. The 6th house traditionally has to do, as I said, with traditionally it's things like illness, injuries, work, and subordinates or people who have a subordinate role underneath you if you have anybody that you're sort of the boss of or in charge of in some way. So Jupiter moving into this area is usually a period of growth and expansion with respect to those topics. It could indicate some positive health developments or some positive developments in terms of either your work, if you have a specific job where you're not necessarily the one in charge, or alternatively, 6th house Jupiter transits can sometimes coincide with benefits from people who work underneath you or work for you if you find yourself in that role in terms of whatever your work is. So I'm mentioning this transit even though it doesn't begin until very late December of 2021. We can see Jupiter moving into Pisces here on the 28th of December, which is extremely late in the year. However, I'm mentioning it here because there's going to be a preview period that begins way back in May when Jupiter dips into Pisces just barely for a couple of months from May 13th, and then it'll station retrograde at like 1 degree of Pisces on June 20th, and then Jupiter will retrograde back out of Pisces and move back into Aquarius for the rest of the year, for the second half of the year on July 28th. So what this means is that there'll be a little preview period from mid-May until late July of Jupiter going into your 6th house. So one of my recommendations would be to pay attention to any developments that take place in your 6th house around that time, especially in terms of health matters or matters pertaining to work, because you're going to find that those become much larger themes in 2022 when Jupiter returns to Pisces to stay for the entirety of the next year. So that's something to pay attention to and watch out for as a major trend that's upcoming that you'll get a little bit of a preview of in 2021. All right, I'm going to see if there's anything else I meant to mention, but I think that actually might be it in terms of this horoscope and this sort of bird's eye view of the astrology of 2021. So thanks a lot for watching or listening. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, and good luck in 2021, and I'll see you again next year for the horoscopes for 2022. All right. Many of the images and calendars that were used in this episode are now available as posters on the astrologypodcast.com website. This includes our 2021 planetary alignments calendar, which shows all of the ingresses and retrogrades and lunations this year, the planetary movements calendar, which shows how far through the signs of the zodiac each of the planets will get during the course of 2021, and also other posters that we have, like our significations of the 12 houses poster, so that you can personalize and understand how each of these transits relates to your own birth chart. We also recently released our 2021 Auspicious Elections Full Year Ahead Electional Astrology Report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through each of the next 12 months and we picked out one lucky date, which would be good for launching new ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So you can find out more about that report at chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on Patreon. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, Ariana Amor, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, and Nadia Habhab. For more information about how to become a patron or have your name listed in the credits, please visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening online May 27th through the 31st, 2021. Find out more information at norwac.net. The Mountain Astrologer magazine, which you can find out more information about at mountainastrologer.com. The ISAR Astrology Conference, happening August 18th through the 22nd, 2021. More information at isar2020.org. The Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, which you can find out more information about at honeycomb.co. Also, the Portland School of Astrology, more information at portlandastrology.org. The AstroGold Astrology app, available for both iPhone and Android, available at astrogold.io. And finally, the primary software program that we use on episodes of the Astrology Podcast is called Solar Fire Astrology Software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can get a 15% discount with the promo code AP15.